Let me know when you're ready and I will start the timer.
Ready. Sure. All right, we're ready.
Okay, good to go.
Our presentation today is intended to discuss the proper course of action required to return the United States to a state of fiscal sustainability. In our presentation, as shown on the second slide, we'll begin with our current fiscal outlook into the economy. We then move into our proposal and discussion of how we intend to implement proposed adjustments. Specifically, we focus on the feasibility of our options and how we intend to use them to reach our goal of fiscal sustainability. We end with our revised fiscal outlook. As mentioned previously, we'll begin with our current fiscal outlook. When compared to other world economies, it may be shocking to see that the U.S. is not the major leader in debt to GDP. While this may be true, this does not mean our current position is not of major concern. Examining the 5 countries whose levels exceed ours, they've been experiencing significant economic difficulty due to their debt burden. Although our current situation may not seem like a pressing issue, examining the proposed trajectory of the growing deficit spending and therefore debt situation shed an interesting light on our situation.
One of the largest costs of the federal government is the increasing age of the population and longer life expectancies. These both drive up the cost of Social Security and Medicare. This is demonstrated by the projections of outlays of Medicare and Medicaid by the CBO, especially through the expansion of Medicare.
Figure here presents the CBO's estimates of potential real gross domestic product. Relative to historical norms, we can see that growth in potential real GDP is entering a low economic growth state relative to the 1990s. In terms of rising debt drivers, this is problematic because growing the United States economy out of the troublesome debt to GDP situation is not as feasible as when the United States was in a high growth state. Another important driver of rising debt are net interest payments. The red line in the figure presents the CBO's estimates of net interest payments as a portion of GDP. As you can see, in the coming years, these payments increase steadily. We suspect this will be the case because recent changes in fiscal policy will result in a larger amount of federal borrowing. Furthermore, since the financial crisis, the United States has benefited from a low interest rate environment, making financing debt less expensive. Although, as is evident, the effective federal funds rate, the blue line, is moving towards relatively more normal levels. Based on our understanding of the term structure of interest rates, we suspect that this will result in more costly financing of debt and ultimately be another important factor of increasing net interest payments.
As we look at the evolving story of where our spending is being allocated, we see that over the 30-year horizon, mandatory spending and net interest payments will grow to take over 82% of our budget. This is a problem as it will leave us less flexible to respond to any recessionary shocks we might face. Further, the widening gap between growing outlays and revenues remaining flat should be a point of concern moving forward.
As you can see in the first figure, the unemployment rate surpassed that of the CBO's estimates of longer-run inflation, and in the second figure, real GDP is surpassing that of potential. Both of these are indicators that the United States is in the later part of this business cycle. And although expansions do not die of old age, the current capacity of the United States economy should be well understood by fiscal policymakers. As you can see in the figure, the CBO's near-term projections of real GDP growth increased significantly from 2017 to 2018. At a quick glance, this may seem beneficial, although we contend that this increase in near-term growth increases the odds of inflationary pressures and consequently higher interest rates. Therefore, in the medium term, as is indicated by the red line, we suspect that economic growth will be dampened. Another important factor of lower medium-term growth is the expiration of the personal income tax in 2025, that we suspect will result in slightly less economic demand.
Now we are going to move on to our proposal. To achieve our goal of a 75% debt to GDP level, we focus on efficiency and optimal timing. We first deal with revenues through tax code reform and entitlement reform, then deal with outlays through discretionary spending cuts and a one-time novel fiscal stabilizer.
The elderly today have less savings, and the baby boomers' upcoming retirement is severely underfunded. The average cost of living per year per retiree is roughly $41,000, and the average savings per retiree is roughly $96,000. This is only a little bit over 2 years worth of savings. Retirees should not rely on Social Security as their income after these 2 years. Unemployment benefits, while costly, are understandable during a recession. Therefore, these benefits should come with some expectations, such as the beneficiary getting education for a new job. Regarding switching the previous tax brackets, we are aware of the inequality issue, but it is not our main focus as we do not want to make the gap wider. The top brackets will also likely be benefiting from the new corporate income tax. By raising the tax on alcohol and tobacco, there are positive health externalities.
The first option in entitlement reform provides better allocation than if done at the federal level. While we do place more responsibility on states, in the long run this will be more efficient and states will be better at making the tough choices that correspond with entitlement spending. The second two options, while small, will increase efficiency in the agricultural insurance market and correct for deadweight loss currently in the market. It is shown here that as more and more baby boomers retire, outlays of Social Security increase at a rapid rate. Linking Social Security to a progressive pricing index will reduce growth of initial benefits for workers who had higher earnings, but will also correct for the overpayment of current cost of living adjustments. A large reason healthcare is so expensive is the sheer amount of malpractice insurance doctors must hold. By reducing the claims made, this will lighten the amount of insurance doctors must hold and reduce overall Medicare costs. The imposed caps on federal spending for Medicaid will incentivize states to reduce their overall Medicaid costs.
We'll now move on to discretionary spending. The U.S. is often criticized for its excessive defense spending. However, if we break down discretionary spending into defense versus non-defense, you can see that as of 2015, defense spending no longer is a major driver of the increasing deficit. While defense spending may not be the majority of U.S. discretionary spending any longer, it begs the question, is it truly necessary that we spend the aggregated amount of the next 8 highest defense spending?
Our first 2 discretionary cuts come in the Defense Department. We propose replacing the Joint Strike Fighter program with F-16 and F-18. This results in a savings of $41 billion. We believe that the additional schedule delays and cost growth of the F-35 program far outweigh the stealth benefits we gain, and the F-16 and F-18s will be sufficient enough to meet any threats we may face. Further, we propose replacing some military personnel with civilian employees. This is not a suggestion to replace higher-end contract workers, but rather lower-level clerical workers, as civilian employees are cost-efficient and can be more effective or just as productive. Additional discretionary cuts include reducing funding for the International Affairs Program by 25%. This results in a large savings of $131 billion. There is research suggesting that there are low marginal returns on these investments, and this cut will encourage the private sector to lead the way in these efforts. Further, the proposal to reduce the size of the federal workforce through attrition is the result of research suggesting that we are overpaying federal workers who do not hold college degrees. Through this option, government agencies can be just as effective, and we can save money while doing it.
The final part of our proposal is a novel one-time fiscal stabilizer. In 2009 and 2013, the American Society of Civil Engineers rated the United States infrastructure a D, indicating that there are deficiencies in the current United States infrastructure, and these deficiencies do not seem to be improved. Therefore, we plan to improve upon these deficiencies in infrastructure by first allocating funds to projects that lead to long-term changes in how infrastructure is designed, built, and maintained. Then we will promote state independence from the federal government in terms of infrastructure spending. In other words, states should be more informed on the type and size of infrastructure spending and where it should be allocated. Finally, we want to promote public-private relationships when the private sector can improve the outcomes of infrastructure spending. Although the real novelty of our plan is that this form of fiscal stimulus will be allocated at an optimal time that will not only improve the United States infrastructure, but also the fiscal sustainability of the United States. Recent literature by Auerbach and Gordenchenko finds that fiscal stimulus during periods of recessions help improve fiscal sustainability. Specifically, they find that a 1% increase of government spending as a portion of GDP results in a decrease of debt to GDP of 2.12%. Based on this research, we propose that our infrastructure plan will be enacted at the onset of the next recession. And this will also eliminate the inside lag of policymaking when immediate action is pivotal. We will infer the onset of the next recession by the GDP-based recession indicator index as proposed by Hamilton. Once the plan is enacted, we will allocate $1 trillion to infrastructure spending. But in other words, increase government spending as a portion of GDP by roughly 5%. Based on literature, we suspect over the medium term it would decrease debt to GDP by 10%. To ensure that spending is evenly distributed over the recession, we'll place a minimum of $115 billion to infrastructure and a maximum of $300 billion. Although as economists, we do not believe throwing money at our problems will necessarily fix them. Consequently, we'll allocate funds to start a special council that is entrusted with researching and bridging the gap of information between states and federal government in terms of where to allocate spending.
While the short-term horizon appears to be continuing current trends, the long-run 30-year leads to fiscal sustainability. The rising debt projections are not as bad as the CBO outlooks. Our revised projections indicate political feasibility with a balanced approach by increasing revenues and decreasing outlays. This returns debt to GDP to 75% over the long term of 30 years. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you guys. Do you want to lower the presentation so we can see you?
Yes.
Or do you want to click out of it so that we can see the table? Awesome, okay, we can start with questions.
I had a question. The tax stuff went by me a little fast. Would you, are you basically repealing the entire tax package that was just passed, including the corporate tax cuts?
No, sir. We would just be reverting the tax brackets regarding no income tax.
Yeah, the corporate income tax would remain in effect at the 21.
Okay. All right.
I'm sorry, just building on that, were you also making changes to individual deductions?
Yes, sir. We were changing the deductibility to change how people consume. So we would prefer that ages 45 to 65, we'd like to change their consuming rate and increase their savings. And that's why we would lower their deductibilities and increase deductibilities for ages 25 to 45. So that way they would consume more.
And can you give me an example of what, I mean, is that the standard deduction, or are you talking about changing how much they can deduct for giving to charity?
Just standard deductions.
Okay.
I have a question. In all of your policy options, you listed a specific dollar amount. Over what time frame is that dollar amount?
So those dollar amount savings are from the 10-year horizon as presented in the CBO's options for reducing the budget. So those are all 10-year savings horizons.
How did you extrapolate those options into your second and third decades?
So we just continue with trends about what the savings would be and extrapolated them based off those savings numbers to get to our final over the second and third decade.
So like linear trends, or did you check the growth rates? What did you do for say bridging from the 10th year to the 11th year?
Sure. So we just continue with linear trends.
Linear trends. Okay.
So what was the presentation of your plan went by very fast, so it was hard for me to add it up in my mind. So when you got to the chart at the end, which was really helpful about spending to GDP and revenue to GDP, I was struck by how much the spending to GDP line comes down. Are there one or two features of your plan that are primarily driving that?
Yeah, so the one-time fiscal stabilizer, as I mentioned, would result in a decrease over a 5-year horizon of 10% of debt to GDP. So that's one way that we would put downward pressure on that?
Second way that downward pressure would be put is through the conversion of state grants into converting multiple assistance programs into block grants for states. So the federal government would transfer payments for assistance programs to states in the form of block grants. So the states would actually be better to allocate these funds, and the savings would come from the overall overhead costs due to managing multiple assistance programs at the federal level and instead doing it at the state level.
Okay, and then one follow-up question about the block grants of SNAP and of Medicaid. So you made the point with infrastructure that infrastructure spending in principle could be deployed in a counter-cyclical manner. One concern that people express about block granting SNAP or Medicaid is that you lose the counter-cyclical aspect that they have under their current system, where they automatically scale up if we fall into recession and automatically scale down when we come out. Was that something you thought about, and it didn't concern you for those programs, or just be interested in your thoughts?
No, we definitely thought about that. So currently, the funding for those programs is typically 80% federal level and 20% state level. We believe that the federal government should still be responsible for the majority of payments to states. So we would transfer it to a 60-40 in order to counter the turns in a cyclical cycle so that we don't lose the benefits of transferring them to states.
Okay, thanks.
So one of your really interesting ideas is this automatic fiscal stimulus for infrastructure. But you indicate that it only comes into place if we hit a recession. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right.
When do you assume we hit a recession? In your modeling, when do you make that assumption?
So we don't have any assumption of when the next recession will be, but instead we will use the GDP-based recession index that was proposed to indicate the onset of a recession. And essentially other research has been done to find a threshold value of like when this index hits a certain probability we're in a recession. So they find that at 67%, we generally do not have false positive of recessions, and that's what we would use to infer the next recession.
So that
Okay. But is it not the case that in your projections you are getting savings from this
Correct.
infrastructure program that's reducing the debt to GDP ratio at some point? When does that mechanically happen in your modeling?
Can you ask that question one more time just to make sure we're clear?
Sure, no problem. So you were asked earlier, like what are your large spending cuts and things like that? What's driving it? And you mentioned the fiscal stimulus for infrastructure. So you're indicating that you're getting savings somewhere in your modeling from the infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So, but general rules of thumb in these long-term CBO baselines is that we actually never hit a recession.
Right.
But if you're having a fiscal stimulus, you need to make a determination at some point where it is helping your debt to GDP ratio, where it's helping increase spending and increase revenue so that we avoid a recession or something like that. Right. And I'm just trying to figure out when it's coming into place in your modeling so that is it slowly ramping up, or what's driving your savings there and when?
So obviously there's time lag effects from the infrastructure spending plan, which I think are evident in our revised outlook. We don't know when the next recession will be. We can assume, since we are in the later phases of this business cycle, that it may be on the short to medium term horizon. So I think these savings effects are modeled in our revised outlook. But I think it looks about 2024 is when we start to see this turnaround and return to the 75% debt to GDP level per year. So there is that time effect from the infrastructure spending, which I think is incorporated into our model with moderate amount.
Yeah, and if I might just add, that's a very valid point.
You just spend just a couple seconds talking about why you think 75% is a good target. Obviously, there are people who think it should be much, much higher, much, much lower. Why is that roughly, in your view, an appropriate target to shoot for?
While we do require some level of debt for financing increased aggregate demand and things, so there is a possibility that could be too high, and modeling suggests that the 60 to 90% threshold is more of a sweet spot. So there isn't too much pressure to go below 75%, but where we're on the track to go now might be too high and reduce our fiscal space.
And 75% leaves us at a stable point to be able to respond to any recessionary shocks we might face.
Right.
Okay. Did you give any consideration to carbon tax?
We did not. So there is the feasibility aspect of our plan, and there are only so many things that we know that can get passed. So we tried to focus on things that gave us good savings or a moderate amount of savings that we thought were going to be politically feasible to get through.
One question from me. You mentioned a progressive pricing index for the Social Security benefits. Which index are you referring to exactly? Is that chain CPI? What did you mean by progressive pricing index?
So by the progressive pricing index, we mean that we would reduce the growth of benefits for initial workers who had higher earnings. So the takers of Social Security in the longer term their benefits would be decreased, but not current term, and it would be linked to a chain CPI index.
Got it. Yeah, the one critique of that has been chain CPI. There's a general view that we're overpaying relative to cost of living adjustments just over time with the current structure. The question is whether chain CPI actually reflects the cost of living for people in retirement. And so there's a question of whether that's still kind of it's a cut, but it's not necessarily more accurate relative to the current place. So it provides some savings, but there is a question around whether that index is overall appropriate for that group.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I think that's something we would explore before we implemented these proposals to make sure we truly were picking the right pricing index to leave everybody better off.
Who does the pain of this plan fall on mostly? Is it lower income people, middle class, the 1%? I mean, who gets hit?
We tend to feel that it's more of a net neutral effect across the board. While we do try to shift some tax burden away from the lower middle class, it is offset by us keeping the corporate income tax. So we hope that everybody will everyone will take the brunt of the impact equally.
In your debt to GDP and deficit to GDP modeling, you have a chart at the end of your presentation, and it kind of shows that it looks, my understanding of it is your deficit is essentially going to zero by the end of the 30-year window. Is that correct?
Correct. That is the long-term goal and plan of long-term goal of our plan, and we believe that.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so mechanically, in the last few years of there, it looks, if my memory serves me correct from when you did your presentation, that you were balanced for maybe 1 or 2 years at the end. Is that correct? You had deficits equal to zero?
Yeah, correct. So the 30-year horizon gets us to 2048, and I believe that 2046, 2047, it does hit that 0 point.
Okay. Now, but at the same time, your debt to GDP ratio is flat in those years. mechanically, if we have a balanced budget, the debt to GDP ratio, unless the economy is not growing, should be falling simultaneously with that.
Yes, you are correct. So it's really hard to know what's going to happen 30 years from now. The 10-year horizon, which is what the CBO projects, is I think why they do what they do is because they can say, okay, in 10 years we know that this is going to be a general case, but 30 years makes it quite more difficult. So while the long mechanics may not line up exactly, we got as close as we can for what we know and what we do and project on the 30-year horizon.
Other than your infrastructure plan, what in your package of ideas has the potential for accelerating economic growth, particularly productivity growth?
Yeah, so do you go?
By pushing back the early retirement age to 65, you keep people in the labor force for a longer time. And studies have shown that they are more productive and more efficient. And by keeping them in the labor force, you also give them more time to save and consume. And we feel that by keeping them in, the labor force participation rate should, instead of drastically decreasing, should become more of a balanced out towards the end.
So just to follow up on Social Security, did you all run out the numbers to see what the implications of your proposals are just for Social Security by itself? Is it sustainably solvent in the future? Is it still running some deficits we need to worry about from a trust fund point of view? Is it running surpluses?
So I don't think we may have considered that while building the presentation, but did not build that matter into our presentation. We believe that the Social Security cuts that we did, or reforms, that we did make are sustainable and will lead to a more sustainable overall fiscal situation for our government.
Okay, thanks.
What other ideas did you guys eliminate for political feasibility? Talk a little bit more about that, whether it's immigration, whether it's other types of taxes. Don mentioned the carbon tax. How did you guys think about other ideas that were not in the presentation and eliminate them?
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Can you talk through what other ideas you eliminated for political feasibility? We mentioned the carbon tax earlier, but curious how you guys thought through some of the other ideas that are out there on the revenue side and also on the spending side, whether it's immigration to boost growth, whether it's marijuana legalization's come up in the past, whether it's, there's a lot of ideas out there. What other things do you guys eliminate along the political feasibility line, and explain your thinking there?
Do you remember any of the ones that you didn't? So how we kind of went about this was the CBO makes those options for reducing the federal budget. We created this into a data set and basically sorted it largest to smallest to see, okay, what can we cut that gives us a good effect? And then beyond, we didn't just look at the numbers, we looked at what the actual plan was and tried to do some research on the viability of those things. Like you said, there's the immigration option, the marijuana option. There's hundreds of things out there that we could do. And so we just chose to select the ones that we think we actually can do and actually will be able to get through a Congress at this point. One further point we want to add is, in terms of political feasibility, while we're on that, is we do want to propose a pseudo-independent organization for similar to how the Federal Reserve acts in terms of monetary policy, but in terms of fiscal policy. We think that this would be an option to better ensure long-run fiscal sustainability. Because these short-run policymakers handle fiscal policy with the short run in mind, but this organization has the potential to do it with the long-term in mind, which could be better off for everyone.
We have time for one more question.
Okay. So one of the major spending cuts you have is this block granting process, sending money to the states and so on and so forth. Could you just describe how block grants save money?
So block grants save money because when we give the resources to the states to allocate, it saves money at the federal level because we don't have to spend money on the administrative costs. And it also saves money because the block grants are actually slightly less than the federal government would normally spend. But because the states better allocate those resources, that the lowering of the amount that they actually get, they really don't see because they're more efficient at distributing the funds. So the savings really comes from the administrative side of not having to allocate the funds at the federal level.
So just expanding on that, we believe that the states have the eyes on the ground to see what they really need in their areas. And so giving that to the state level could really be beneficial to everyone with the savings.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Hi.
Hey guys, Team 106.
Yes.
Okay,
How's
perfect.
our audio?
We can hear you perfectly.
Great.
Okay, before we get started, we'll go around quickly and introduce ourselves, and then I will lay down the groundwork. So I'm Mikal. You all know me pretty well by now. You received many emails from me.
Hi, I'm Jim Pethokoukis from the American Enterprise Institute.
Hi, I'm Zachary Moller from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget.
Donald Marron from the Urban Institute.
Russ Grody from Hamilton Place Strategies.
Okay, so as you guys know, you're gonna have 12 minutes for the presentation and 18 minutes for the Q&A. I will keep a timer, and you all can also keep a timer, and I'll warn you when you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, and when time's up. I'll hold a big time card. After that, the last person speaking has to stop. And then the other last thing to remember is not to share anything that can identify which school you are from, so remain anonymous. But other than that, whenever you're ready, we can get started.
We'll share our screen.
Awesome.
Can you see our screen now?
Yes.
Great. Beginning. This is working. Computer froze.
No worries, take your time.
I have a frozen computer. One moment.
Oh boy.
You gonna try the mouse?
Yeah. No one's getting graded on technological capabilities. Okay.
We have the page become.
I would just close it. Yeah, we can close the check on that.
Yeah.
Max, go rock.
Let me refresh this page.
Should we close down?
Mm-hmm.
May not be the Mac, maybe doing it from the cloud. I put on that website yesterday. It was functional for me. Other than, yeah, for my office.
Well, they send their final thing over. We can print it out and they can just talk.
Okay. Do you guys want to email us the website, and then we can just print it out in case the page doesn't work? You can just email it to me.
Or we can huddle around your. Yeah. This is almost like the final. I don't know. You can huddle around your computer if it needs to be interactive. Yeah. Although I think this is not quite the. Yeah. You want to switch the mouse over? It's good you built in some buffers.
Yes. Never.
We actually have a rule when we pitch clients, it's always printouts for this reason. Yeah. We never. We've seen it all go wrong every time. Well, Taylor Griffin, our old partner, he used to like to basically test the technology on pitches, which was saw it fail way too many times.
I'm just going to tell him to.
I saw something the other day about how when you're pitching venture capitalists, it's allegedly bad form being a printed copy.
Really?
It struck me as weird for exactly that reason.
That's
as
weird.
Wonderful as technology is, analog is pretty robust too.
Yeah, I mean, venture capitalists sometimes have their portfolio companies hire us to help them out with some stuff, and I just actually built a presentation for one of them just because.
You don't want to find yourself doing like this. Now imagine.
Yeah.
That would go like that.
I do like when I get the get the projections of sales. I'm like, I start charting it out, and I start asking like, so like I do a lot of the questions you were asking, like, why does it go down in year 6? Like, what's the deal there? Like, oh, we just kind of picked this one contract, probably not the role. Like, it's all determined. I'm like, because most of these guys have like 4 clients, and so they're like projecting like, I just don't think we're gonna keep that client. Like 25% of your client base is like, it's probably not gonna stick around after 6 years.
That's good. Well, that's better than the smooth.
Yeah, it is.
You know, I think there's
To the sky.
and 100% renewals.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, they said they're restarting their computer, but we also have the link, so I don't know if we should just print it out anyways.
So I have this.
Right.
It's kind of like it has a bunch of stuff on it.
Yeah, if you go to the link at the top, the fiscal challenge
Oh,
GAs, yeah, I think we should be
So-
able to print it out.
There's a whole presentation built around FAFSA. That would be I give them high marks for creativity. That is an interesting lens in which to get the.
Oh yeah, or so
Yeah, just in case, like, even if they restart the computer, it doesn't work.
yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that, I should have printed out the.
I kind of thought they all would have updates to their stuff anyway. So
Yeah.
Alright, this is actually really interactive. So
Okay, we can see if they.
Is your computer really called a yoga?
All right, we are back.
Oh.
Sorry about the technical difficulties. This is why we call in early.
Yep.
Exactly.
Then just share the screen. How's the camera angle?
just making sure that this is actually really cool software.
I've
Like,
never heard of it.
Yeah, it's actually like
It's very neat.
it's actually really nice and like it's actually interactive. Yeah, what's it called? I don't know.
Can you hear us okay?
PowerBook?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, sweet. Just let us know when,
Okay.
when to begin.
Yeah, you can begin whenever.
All right. So, good morning and welcome to our discussion on how to stabilize the U.S. debt to GDP ratio at its current level by 2047. Right now, the debt to GDP ratio stands at 77%, but in the next 30 years, the debt is projected to reach over 150% of GDP.
The recovery from the Great Recession has involved a fiscally toxic mix of bailouts, aggressive spending, and reckless borrowing. Publicly held federal debt is set on a trajectory which propels our nation into uncharted territories. Our collection of fiscal proposals humbly attempts to abate this aggressive tangent.
This page displays figures from the Congressional Budget Office that illustrate the breakdown of where the federal government derives its budget and how the money is allocated.
These are the issues that we'll be covering. The term cost savings, displayed on each slide, indicates net federal revenue and/or savings generated from the proposal.
Our tax reform proposal has two tenets. First is treating employer-sponsored insurance as regular compensation, and the second is estate tax reform. Our employer-sponsored insurance proposal raises approximately $260 billion in tax revenue by indexing with rising healthcare costs. 50% of households will be affected, with the fourth and fifth income quintiles bearing the majority of the burden.
Our state tax reform essentially moves us back to the 2009 policy by increasing the tax rate to 45% from 40%, and decreasing the exemption from 11 million to 3.5 million. This will raise revenues and make for a more progressive tax code.
At the current rate, the Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted and in deficit territory by 2034. To address this funding gap, we propose removing the cap and payroll tax. This would close about 75% of the gap and balance the tax code for the middle class and the top 20% of earners.
Great points, Guy. To close the remaining 25%, taxing state and local government employees would generate extra revenue in the short term, though would eventually require payouts. Longevity indexing, or setting the retirement age based on life expectancy, would reduce payouts starting in 2030. The combination of the three would stabilize the fund and save the government over $4.3 trillion from 2035 to 2047.
Current federal gas tax policy is not indexed to inflation. Our proposal is to increase it by 25 cents to put it back into the 1990s level and then index the new rate to inflation. We assert that a gas tax is utilitarian because it internalizes the externalities of gas inefficient vehicles and urban sprawl.
The McDermott carbon tax taxes a ton of carbon at $12.50, increases by $3.22 per ton annually for 17 years, and then shifts to a 5% increase starting in 2036. The carbon tax, combined with the gas tax, will generate over $5.8 trillion in revenue.
To address homelessness, research has shown that investing in supportive housing can relieve over $13,000 of financial burden per head, in addition to reducing instability among homeless families and giving a new cohort of the population the ability to contribute to society.
Through investment in already existing programs such as FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation grant program, the government can cut future disaster losses by a 4-to-1 loss to investment ratio, exacerbated by the projected rise in natural disasters.
In addition, we currently spend over $70 billion per year on the regressive mortgage interest deduction, the majority of which goes to households with incomes over $100,000. By replacing it with a first-time home ownership credit system, we will spend less than a third of current spending while extending home ownership opportunities to lower-income households.
Currently, there is excessive waste in the U.S. healthcare sector and significant rooms for saving in Medicare.
A huge percentage of U.S. healthcare spending is on terminal care. There is evidence to suggest that we can not only save money, but also improve family outcomes by shifting patients to at-home care. This saves about 2.5% of Medicare costs.
General practitioners are more expensive than practitioners, but have the same outcomes. By transitioning 20% of patients to this cheaper option, almost 2% of costs can be saved.
By pricing drugs based on outcomes, we can reduce waste and incentivize efficiency. This would save the Medicare program over 1.4%.
The extensive analysis done by the Project on Government Oversight found that the average military contract worker costs 2.94 times more than the average government worker in the same exact position. Reducing service contractors by 15% could save $300 billion over the next 10 years alone.
Currently, the U.S. operates at a 22% property overcapacity. We recommend an annual 1% decrease in military property for subsequent conversion to civilian use.
Great point. But our military has become top-heavy. The enlisted to officer ratio has decreased by 20% since 2000. It is imperative to gradually reduce the size of the officer corps while filling vacant positions using lower-cost recruitment methods.
Furthermore, it's necessary to address healthcare in the military. Consolidating medical services across military branches will allow for more streamlined and efficient healthcare for service members. This is in line with the 2012 proposal by the Department of Defense.
One of the most overlooked ways to increase tax revenue is to provide community college grants to states. The states maintain their own agency in how to spend the money, and better educated citizens means better outcomes for the working class, higher salaries, and rapid return on investment from increased tax revenues.
Capping student borrowing and adjusting the terms for the loans will make it easier for low-income students to pursue a degree and reduce the costs of current student loan programs to the federal government. Increased productivity from greater accessibility to graduate programs will also provide a revenue windfall.
Putting more resources to help low-income students in areas outside of purely academic contexts, such as food and after-school care, has a much higher return on investment than pouring money into, for example, smartboards. Students who do better in secondary school as a result of a strong foundation from the Head Start program will in the long run help to repay the cost of the program.
Finally, on the education front, we could simplify the FAFSA aid calculations to be bracketed to income rather than to be based on a complicated formula that few ordinary people can understand. Currently, middle-class families with a liquid asset struggle to get strong FAFSA aid and are often expected to liquidate assets to pay for college. Our combined education proposals save the federal government nearly $800 billion over the next 30 years.
And as it pertains to criminal justice, our proposal mandates that convicts found guilty of non-egregious crimes would have parole options reinstated because for every one federal inmate that is granted parole, the U.S. could effectively save more than $30,000 per prisoner for every year the prisoner is on parole and not in prison.
In order to help maintain the safety of America's public, we assert that only a maximum of 10% of federal prison population should be granted parole each year. But if a parolee were to violate their parole conditions and be reintegrated into prison, they would not count towards the 10%.
And by reinstating parole for federal inmates, it could effectively result in a net savings of more than $500 million in 2018 alone. And all things being done in equal, enacting such policy could effectively save the U.S. more than $18.5 billion by 2047.
In addition to having parole reintroduced for federal inmates, we can further mitigate overcrowding in prisons by federally decriminalizing marijuana.
By doing so, the U.S. would save nearly $34,000 for every individual who would have been imprisoned for a year. With over 11,000 individuals federally imprisoned as a result of violating current marijuana laws, these individuals would cost taxpayers more than $400 million by the end of 2018. Assuming the current trend in crime rates, decriminalization of marijuana could save the United States more than $13 billion for the next 30 years.
Converting the current ballot system to a blockchain-based solution dollars over the next 30 years, increase transparency, and better enhance voter accuracy.
Currently, electronic nicotine delivery devices are untaxed federally. Though healthier than cigarettes, they still have negative health outcomes associated, and a tax on them could discourage unhealthy activity and generate revenue.
Finally, there are many negative externalities for cash usage relating to tax evasion and other crime. By imposing an excise tax on this, you reduce these externalities by discouraging usage and making these activities generally less appealing. Additionally, a large amount of revenue is generated, mainly from indirect taxation of the gray market. $1.6 trillion are projected to be generated over the next 30 years from this policy.
Overall, our proposals lower the debt to GDP level to 55.79% by 2048, leaving room for incidental policy needs, such as shorter-term GDP-boosting spending programs that may arise from unforeseeable future circumstances. Thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Do you guys want to lower the presentation so that we can see you for the Q&A?
Sure.
Sure. You know,
I got it, yeah.
Cool.
I can scroll the slides if you guys need reference.
I'll stop screen sharing.
Here.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even read it.
Yeah. No, it's good to see you.
Sure.
Yeah.
You guys have the link if you want to go through it.
I have it here, so if there's a reference, just tell me the slide and I'll pull it up.
Sweet. You mind passing me my phone with it?
All set.
All right, I'll start with a really incredibly minor question, but since you brought it up in the end. If you think we should tax cash, does that mean you think we should also tax Bitcoin, Ether, and other electronic forms of money?
So currently the cryptocurrency world is far too undeveloped to even begin thinking about regulation. While there will be lots of necessary regulation as it becomes, a greater part of our society, it's currently too undeveloped to begin regulating.
Additionally, the cost of regulation could outweigh any revenue, and we don't necessarily want to disincentivize innovative markets, though in the long term we would look towards those as regulated as well.
Should cryptocurrencies become a bigger part of our society, it's going to be imperative to regulate them. As we know, there's a large amount of black market transactions in drugs, firearms, pretty much anything you can think of that are based on cryptocurrencies.
So the 2 or 3 things that are most responsible for reducing the debt GDP ratio were what? I'm sure it's in there, but that got by me. So your 2 or 3 biggest drivers were what?
Certainly tax reform is one of our biggest drivers.
The healthcare and mortgage, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and also the environmental policies bring in a huge revenue windfall as well. That would help a lot.
And with Social Security, the government could save over $4.3 trillion from 2035 to 2047, making it also one of our bigger contributions to reducing the debt to GDP ratio.
All right.
I'm sorry, so putting all of those together, do you have any sense of what revenues to GDP and spending to GDP look like in your out years?
Spending is fairly constant. We have some spending increases, but mostly we left spending untouched.
Yeah, so most of our programs are revenue generating from different tax proposals and whatnot. But as far as spending goes, we didn't concentrate as much on that part because we sort of saw, spending on the GDP side as something that is going to need to be a lot more short-term based on the specific economic conditions of that time. And we found it pretty difficult to try and structure, 30-year spending programs, which is why we left space. We lowered our total rate to 55.8%. We left space up to that 77% to allow for incidental spending that we will see necessary in the short term.
Although within the places that we would spend, we decided to spend on people, especially in terms of the housing department. We decided to increase investment in homelessness programs and preventing future natural disasters by promoting sustainable development across the board.
And one area where we did put savings in is the healthcare sector. Just looking at pure waste areas, we can save about 5%, which is a very substantial amount of money considering the $700 billion we spent.
All of our spending is very oriented on the return on investment that we would get from that spending. So ultimately, through spending, through our spending programs, we look to ultimately make the goal of those spending programs to somehow increase revenue indirectly.
What is your guys' sense of what is currently driving the fiscal situation and the increasing debt in the United States? What is causing the current problem that you guys are attempting to solve?
So, certainly historically, war has been a huge contributor to such an issue. The only other time in history that the debt to GDP ratio was higher than this was post-World War II, but there's no comfort in that historical precedent because the spending that we have today is on a totally irresponsible tangent. So it started in the early 2000s, spending in overseas wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then by 2008, with the financial crisis, it was necessary for the government to bail out major corporations and increase spending to keep our economic boat afloat. So the combination of these bailouts and sort of toxic spending combined with high costs of overseas wars and just generally higher costs to run our nation have made it necessary for the U.S. government to take out large amounts of debt.
And in the long term especially, a lot of the aging population has a large impact on programs such as Medicare and Social Security, which are giant areas of public finance. And so when we have to account for these increases in spending with increases in revenue, which we haven't really begun to do yet.
Yeah, those demographic trends are going to really hurt us in the future. So it's important to watch out for those.
it seems that you view spending as sort of, that's just the way it is, so we better focus on revenue increases. That certainly isn't the perception in Washington, and it's very hard to talk about getting anything done that doesn't have some balance. Do you feel that your plan maybe is not politically balanced enough, the fact it focuses so heavily on revenue increases?
I think that our revenue increases, the way we target our revenue increases, makes it more politically feasible than just like increasing the income tax, for example. So what we do is we like very subtly find ways to raise revenue without just like outwardly putting out huge tax reforms, just like more like obviously relative to like how huge tax reform can be, minor tax reforms that do raise a lot of money without really a lot of people considering that. And ultimately, I think that with like the more targeted and niche revenue approaches, it's more politically feasible than if you were to like completely rewrite the tax code with like income taxes, which we avoided for the most part.
And I think if this project targeted, if it was based on the next 5 years or maybe even the next 10 years, I think we would, we would concentrate more on the GDP side. But the way that we see it is a lot of federal spending programs look more to the short term rather than the 30-year term. And our proposals concentrate more on this longer term. So we found it rather difficult to implement sort of shorter term spending programs over the long term because they're going to be incidental based on the economic situation at that time. And it's pretty difficult to predict exactly where we're going to be, 20, 30 years from now.
So I'm sorry, on the screen, it's the gentleman on the far right. Looked like he had something to add on that.
Andre?
Oh yeah, myself. I wanted to say that while we are focusing on spending now, or generating revenue now, we are trying to generate this revenue so that it can be used in later spending. For example, with a McDermott carbon tax, with the revenue that we get from this tax, we could subsidize the oil industry less and put some of that money that we take away from the oil industry and that we get from this tax and spend it on clean energy projects and other environmentally sensitive and aware programs that will eventually also help reduce our current debt to GDP ratio.
And we did really try and focus on things that had positive externalities.
Yeah.
For instance, for the employer-sponsored medical insurance, that's like been very definitively shown to drive up healthcare costs artificially. And so by gradually removing that policy, we're having a negative or a positive outcome of slowing growth in spending.
A lot of our proposals also just seemed like common sense to us. For example, the gas tax, the fact that this was at a fixed rate from the 90s doesn't make any sense. It should be indexed to inflation. It's pretty obvious that the dollar 20 years ago is very different than the dollar today. So, I mean, something like that was just logical to us to peg to inflation.
To be brief, concise, and straightforward, in order to spend money, you need to make money first, and which is why we targeted boosting the revenue side first before spending.
Do you have any sense of, so one thing your presentation had that was very good was you had total dollar amounts for each category. How does that all add up? What is your total savings in dollars over the 30-year window?
I don't know last thought.
No.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, we should have added it up.
Yeah.
We didn't add it up. I can't do the math that quickly in my head.
You do know that it's over $4.3 trillion, though, alone from the Social Security. It's.
At the end of the day, the debt to GDP offsets, and we essentially cut that in half by 2047.
Our GDP projections were just from the
Congressional Budget Office.
Yeah. So the percentage is tied directly to that.
Okay, so for like any given year, you have your cuts, and your denominator is GDP as done by CBO, and so you don't make any assumptions about GDP growth. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay.
Did you guys think at all about how some of your proposals impact GDP, and specifically tax hikes? Again, if you're going on the revenue side, you guys speak about economic growth in the way that the government drives it by doing those positive externalities. Did you guys think of some of the drawbacks, or maybe higher taxes across the board in terms of driving productivity and labor leisure trade-offs, things like that?
So there is definitely a significant amount of discussion about this throughout the process. Like, should we adjust GDP? Should we leave it as is? And we decided at the end of the day that trying to figure out, the incidence of each proposal on GDP would be an absolute wormhole to go down. So while maybe we should have, done these GDP projections, we didn't really feel properly equipped, maybe, or properly educated to make those assumptions.
Just for example, let's say we impose the carbon tax, right? Who's to say that as a result of that, suddenly we'll have a lot more of a push for making nuclear energy happen again, right? Yeah. That would be huge for offsetting any GDP reduction, because nuclear energy is very cost efficient, for example, and just a lot of unpredictable variables would happen as a result of these policies, so that trying to measure GDP would immediately, just a few years after policies are implemented, the GDP projections would be off in all likelihood.
And a lot of our policies we tried to introduce over time and not immediately to try and dampen the immediate effects on GDP so that people have time to adjust to the new changes.
Could you give some examples of policies that you phase in over time?
The McDermott carbon tax, we phase in over time. We very gradually scale it up. We started off at a pretty low level. Another policy that would be phased in over time, just by virtue of the way it would impact the people who would benefit from it, would be, for example, the community college one. It would obviously take a few years for people to start taking full advantage of that program, so that would be phased in sort of passively.
Defense spending, selling off these extra military properties, that would be done at 1% annually, so that would be, a gradual sell-off.
Some of the social security policies, such as the longevity indexing, people's life expectancy doesn't increase right away, so that's a gradual change in spending.
Why did you choose to reduce the debt GDP ratio as opposed to hitting the 75% mark, or even making it and let it go up to 100%? Just kind of what do you view as sort of the macroeconomic factors involved there?
Sure. So as you mentioned, we wanted to leave space for these spending programs. We know that we're going to have to spend on, for example, infrastructure in the future. What we don't know is exactly where, or exactly how much. So we wanted to make sure that there was enough of a buffer that, 10 years from now, when the government says, okay, we need to spend, $300 billion in the next 2 years on X, that money will be available to them. So we purposely undershot, because we know that in reality, it's going to be higher than that with spending programs.
And do you think if the debt GDP ratio were to rise, do you think there would be bad economic impact from that? If instead of dropping, if it went up from 75 to 105 or higher, was that part of your calculation that you felt there were crowding out effects, or?
We are spending a lot of money on servicing our debt, and if it gets harder and harder to service the debt, then that means we're going to have to borrow more and more to do that. And we are worried that if we let it go too far above 77%, we're going to see the cycle of just debt getting harder and harder to pay off.
Also, one of the reasons that we also undershot was because we've all of our proposals, to be blunt, may or may not be 100% politically feasible in this current political climate, which is why we try to have an array of proposals that would overall reduce this ratio by any means necessary. So if 5 of our 7 proposals were instituted, while we may not reach that 55%, we may still be at 60%, 70%. It is not meant to not take into account possible government incidental spending over the next 30 years.
And to your point, Mitch, it's incredibly dangerous and irresponsible to be taking out so much debt at such a rapidly increasing level. Someday, the United States already had its credit rating downgraded. And in the future, it's going to be more and more difficult to service this debt. We're going to have to take out increasingly more amounts of debt. And if we look to history, we've never really been in a situation where we're on this trajectory right now. Economists love history. That's where all the data lies. That's where all the ideas lie. So I think we need to figure out how to reverse this tangent that we're on.
And just a final note is that generally the political climate among economists is that if a future recession occurs, we'll use similar bailout policy as we've used in the past. And so the CBO estimates don't project any recession because that's nearly impossible to do. Yeah. But it can be pretty healthily assumed that in the next 30 years there will be downticks that need to be.
That we will mandate government spending and increase that GDP ratio, which is why we undershot.
Time for one more question.
So to what extent did distributional considerations drive the mix of policies you chose? Were you thinking hard about whether you're hitting high-income folks, low-income folks, people in the middle?
That's definitely something we took into account, especially with I'm just going to talk about housing. So especially with considering the mortgage interest deduction, the vast majority of the federal spending on that program goes to very high-income households, over 100K. And that kind of takes away from the original intent of the program to promote home ownership for all parts of society. So by converting that to a first-time home ownership credit system, we implement this federal spending will subsidize home ownership for these lower income people, and we phase that out as you go up the bracket.
Furthermore, both of our tax reforms target a more equal economic landscape. The employer-sponsored insurance being treated as regular compensation would affect primarily the upper fourth and fifth income quintiles. And in addition, increasing the estate tax from 40% to 45% would definitely target higher income earners.
Yeah, but while we target higher income earners, we are also trying to benefit the the middle class citizen, which is why we have the decriminalization of marijuana and the federal parole to help cater to the lower income families and lower middle class.
And
go ahead.
We felt that in general, the tax code as written for income tax is the main area of progressive tax in the federal government. And what we did with our policies was more try and even the playing field. Like for instance, the Social Security, the original intent, which we tried to keep in mind for every program, was to keep the elderly out of poverty. So there's no idea in that original intent that says we should phase out the tax for the high income people.
And to make it more, and to protect high GDP growth, because we need investment from high income individuals, we did not touch corporate tax, we did not touch capital gains tax. And I think that is something that is also really important, right? We want to be able to generate revenue from where there is revenue to be generated. We can't generate revenue we need to from just lower income people. There's not enough money there. So we are left with either high income or corporations. But if we tax corporations, we're going to do undue harm to our GDP. We're going to do undue harm to our economic growth.
We're going to leave the state.
Yeah. So what we have to resort to at the end of the day is making it more progressive on the individual level.
Another one of our proposals that targeted sort of lower income earners was the.
Guys, I think we need to wrap up really quickly.
No problem. Last comment. Our FAFSA proposal targets the middle class families who currently struggle to, have illiquid assets to pay for college. So a large amount of our proposals target the, boosting the middle and lower classes and sort of taxing the upper classes at a higher level.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay. So we're using the computer audio. Okay.
So not to defense.
Can y'all hear us?
Hey guys.
What's going on? Hi.
Chris. So just give us like a few more minutes. I'm gonna mute this, but then we will get started. Okay?
Also, we can't see you.
Yeah, you
Oh yeah, we can see.
Backing up the screen a little bit. Folks on the right have to cut out.
3.5.
Yeah.
It's also dark.
Yeah, maybe. Huh? Yes. Yeah, it's an autoplay. Okay. Is everybody in there? Yeah, I suppose everybody's in there at this point. Although you're gonna have a hard time seeing the screen itself because I'll be right in the middle. It's fine.
That's not changing.
Huh?
No, that's static.
Yeah, it's just like a background. Yeah.
We still have a few minutes. I wonder if there's some lighting. Our figures are darker because the screen's out.
Oh, if you want to go like really quickly, yeah, go.
All right, hey guys, before we get started, I'm just gonna do quick introductions and lay down the ground rules, and then we will be good to go. So I'm Nicole, you all know me pretty well by now.
I'm Jim Pethokoukis from the American Enterprise Institute.
Hi, I'm Zachary Moller from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget.
And Donald Marron from the Urban Institute.
Much greater for multiple strategies.
So as you know, you have 12 minutes for the presentation and 18 minutes for the Q&A. I will be keeping time and I'll hold up time cards when you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, and when time's up, after which you have to stop talking. Other than that, just remember not to identify which school you are from and to remain anonymous. But yeah, if you guys are ready, then please start.
We can wait for your fourth person to get back.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes. Quick question. So will we be screen sharing? Is that the idea?
So how do you guys want to do this? I have their presentation here that I can just put up, and then that way we can just see them the whole time.
It doesn't matter to me.
So I feel like we ought to screen share so it's the same across all the.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, if you don't mind sharing your screen, that would be great. That's what the past groups did, just to keep it consistent.
Yeah. It would just be easier for our presentation too to kind of follow along and whatnot.
Yeah, we'll take the screen down once you guys, for the Q&A session.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so am I able to do that?
Yeah, there should be like a plus icon. Yes.
Okay, let's see.
And then just go to your presentation.
Oh, maybe that's it. Let's see. All right, can y'all see the Google Slides?
Yep.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the beginning then.
Awesome.
All right,
Good.
Yes, perfect. Whenever you're ready.
All right, we're just gonna wait for our member to get back.
Cool.
Sure.
Zach gave me this.
What?
All right, Mahal, we're gonna get started.
All right, hello, we are Team 110 and welcome to our presentation.
I think there's an issue.
More per hour, but the United States economy currently faces serious monitoring risk due to a rapidly expanding debt to GDP ratio.
Hey guys,
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Yeah, just speak a little louder.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. To start that paragraph over again, the United States economy currently faces serious long-term risk due to a rapidly expanding debt-to-GDP ratio. It currently sits at 77%, but the Congressional Budget Office projects it to double to nearly 150% over the next 30 years. According to the World Bank, the United States suffers a 17 basis point decrease in annual growth for each percentage point that the debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 77%. Consequently, we face impaired future growth levels for the next 3 decades. Furthermore, federal interest payments accelerate as the level of debt grows. In the current low-tax, high-spending environment, these risks constrain our ability to pay for any unexpected national expense, such as a war or financial crisis, without heavy borrowing and cuts to social spending. To mitigate these long-term risks, we urge the government to take swift action. Our policy proposals will satisfy 3 broad criteria. The first of these is to restore taxes through a tax overhaul and a carbon tax. The second is a streamlining of government spending, which includes cuts to defense spending, policies to combat the opioid epidemic, and a social security overhaul. The third is productivity support, which includes immigration and education reform. Our goals are to restore fiscal stability and strengthen output.
So our first policy is a tax overhaul, focusing on simplicity for Americans while remaining efficient to collect and manage. We propose shifting the majority of federal tax income from income taxes to a 10% value-added tax. Income taxes will be completely eliminated for individuals with less than $50,000 in income and couples filing jointly with household income under $100,000. All taxes above these thresholds will be taxed at 20%. To combat the regressive nature of a value-added tax, we propose creating an income redistribution program, such as prepaid cash cards distributed to lower-income Americans. Additional revenue will be raised through reducing the collections department of the IRS, as total income tax returns will decrease by over $110 million. This will save over $2 billion annually, and as a step towards simplicity while increasing revenue, we propose increasing the capital gains tax to 20% to match the income tax rate. This overall yields a net revenue increase of $106 billion in 2018 and will decrease the 2047 debt to GDP ratio by 2 percentage points down to 148% overall.
Our next policy is to implement a national carbon tax to counter the long-term economic impact of climate change while raising revenue. There are 2 aspects of this plan. The first is to start with a $40 per metric ton tax that increases at a rate of 2% above inflation for 10 years, for a final tax rate of roughly $49. The second is to implement a $500 per household dividend to combat the regressivity of the carbon tax. The tax generates $175 billion in revenue the first year and reaches $190 billion before declining to account for decreasing carbon dependence. The dividend will initially cost $8 billion and increase slightly to account for population growth. Initially, the plan will include a shock to GDP, but because projections were from before the Trump administration's regulatory rollback, the net effect should be negligible relative to projections. In terms of the overall platform, the carbon tax will reduce the debt to GDP ratio 37 percentage points to an overall ratio of 111%.
So the next portion of our platform concerns streamlining outlays.
U.S. defense spending constitutes the largest portion of annual federal spending. The latest Senate deal sets the 2018 Department of Defense budget at $640 billion, $100 billion over the 2011 budget caps. Data from Brookings Institute and Cato Institute show current spending significantly higher than necessary in order to deal with current and future threats against the United States. In operating this way, the Department of Defense is failing to account for the threat the national debt will have on maintaining national security. Current U.S. grand strategy can be described as primacy, categorized as having nearly unrivaled power in all facets of war and overwhelming first strike capabilities. Our proposal is to shift U.S. grand strategy away from primacy and toward restraint. The Department of Defense would reanalyze credible threats to national security and remove redundant spending. These reductions would be into 3 broad categories: personnel reduction, acquisitions reduction, and nuclear program reduction. Currently, there are no large-scale agitating forces that are poised to fight in direct combat with the United States. In this way, the personnel cuts would follow the same force reduction that DoD is currently using, extended over longer periods of time. With current primacy policies, there is no cohesive strategic direction when choosing how to handle real-world threats. As a result, the Department of Defense is currently bloated with acquisitions and research programs that are both over budget and overlapping in strategic scope. Switching to a grand strategy of restraint would reduce redundancy in acquisition and strategic choice. Lastly, our current nuclear arsenal is far larger than necessary as a means of deterrent. An effective change in grant strategy would considerably reduce the nuclear arsenal and drastically cut modernization programs as a result. A grant strategy of restraint would reduce projected debt to GDP to 82% by 2047.
Our next proposal concerns Social Security. Due to the retirement of the baby boomers, lowered birth rates, and greater life expectancies, estimates suggest Social Security funds will become insolvent in 2034. First, we propose to change the COLA from the CPIW to the chain CPI. Due to substitution bias and small sample size, we believe that CPIW overstates the true rise in the cost of living, and therefore the chain CPI is a more accurate measurement. The chain CPI grows on average about 25 basis points lower each year, so its effects will compound over time. This policy will decrease outlays by a combined $120 billion by 2047. We also propose to raise its share of taxable income to 90% of all earnings, or to annual earnings up to $245,000. Currently, 83% of all total earnings are taxed. Under this policy, those who will now have to increase their annual contributions to Social Security will also see an increase in benefits after retirement. This will also make the Social Security tax less regressive. Although many worry about its effects on working incentives, our analysis suggests that this would only affect people on the margins, or those earning near $245,000 annually. This policy will decrease outlays by a combined $244 billion in 2047. Taken together, these policies will reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 1 percentage point to 81% overall by 2047.
So our next policy concern is the United States opioid epidemic. Currently, this country faces an opioid epidemic like never before. In 2016, about 42,000 Americans died, and this number is growing each year as overdoses increase. What you see in front of you right now is a heat map of counties in deaths per 100,000, overdose deaths, that is, involving opioids. As you can see, there are concentrations in the Southwest, the Rust Belt, and the Upper Northeast, but there are also isolated counties throughout the entire United States, so it's not just a regional problem, but rather a national problem. This is a national problem that costs our country about $75 billion annually, according to the CDC, and that number is only going to go up. So in response, we have a 3-tiered opioid intervention policy. The first of these tiers is the safe implementation of safe injection sites, also known as safe consumption sites. These are essentially medical facilities fully equipped with a staff and life-saving drugs such as naloxone, where addicts may come in and freely use any drug of their choice. The second tier is the reduction of pharmaceutical to physician advertisement. So this is the complete prohibition of pharmaceutical to physician advertisement in an effort to decrease the general opioid volume. And the third is a triplicate state mandate, wherein every prescription opioid painkiller that is written needs to be recorded on 3 copies. 1 copy that goes to the prescribing doctor, 1 copy that goes to the pharmacist, and 1 copy that goes to a state agency known as a Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, or a PDMP. In total, we believe that the implementation of this policy will reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 5 percentage points to a level of 76%. Finally, we'll be moving on to our productivity support section.
Our next policy is an investment in public education. We propose initiating bonuses from federal grants to create a more exaggerated pay scale for teachers and a 3-tiered career path. On average, the middle tier of K-12 teachers will receive a $5,000 annual bonus, and the top tier will receive a $12,500 bonus. Moving up from a bracket comes with increased responsibility and a raise. Teachers in the top 2 brackets will be responsible for mentoring, evaluating, and ensuring quality in the first tier, who will hypothetically be just entering the workforce. This policy will increase the supply of potential workers, leading to increased education quality, which leads to innovation and greater efficiency throughout the entire economy, thus increasing total factor productivity. Based on a paper from Sebastian de Sousa, and given this policy's implementation, the average annual GDP growth rate will be 2.2%. In contrast, CBO data shows GDP increasing each year by an average of 1.9%. Overall, our education policy will decrease the 2047 debt to GDP ratio by 1 percentage point down to 75% overall.
Our next proposal concerns immigration. We propose that the United States pursue a policy similar to that in Senate Bill 744 and grant legal status to around 11 million of the undocumented immigrants already in the United States and increase the availability of work visas. which will be granted primarily to those who graduate from U.S. colleges with degrees in the sciences, technology, engineering, or mathematics. Our estimates suggest that reform will boost GDP, increase productivity, and eventually increase real wages. Although real wages will initially fall, within 10 years, they will be higher than projected values. This increase in wages can be attributed to an increase in productivity, since the proposal expands opportunities for entrepreneurs and investors and those with STEM degrees to work in the United States. GDP will also rise relative to projected values at an average of $17 billion per year, since this proposal will increase the size of the labor force and the size of the population in the United States, will in turn demand more goods and services and therefore increase the demand for labor. Additionally, the immigrant population is much younger on average than the American population. Immigrants will therefore be able to pay into the Social Security system. We project our immigration policy to reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 2 percentage points to 73% overall.
So we project our policies to lower the debt to GDP ratio to 73% through the year 2047. This ratio is near the requested 75%, and we believe that we can heavily mitigate the risks posed by a high debt to GDP ratio. Without our recommendations, the United States faces fiscal pressure in the forms of lower GDP growth and higher government spending. Our economy, which is experiencing a prolonged period of growth, risks squeezing future spending programs from the public, and this effect will be exacerbated by any unforeseen natural disaster, military conflict, or other crisis. Therefore, it is imperative that we enact these policies now. Thank you for your time, and we will now accept questions.
Awesome. Can you guys lower the screen so that we can see you for the Q&A?
Yeah, certainly.
Let's see.
There you go.
Maybe it's
Gonna have the school's logo as the background or something, right?
All right. Did we stop sharing yet? No, it's not there. Stop share. There we go. Okay, cool.
Okay, and we can get started with questions.
Let me start with just a big, broad question. The debt GDP ratio has doubled over the past decade. Interest rates are really low. Why do you think the target you focus on is the right target versus a much higher target? We haven't seen an effect. We haven't seen an impact yet of the higher debt GDP ratio on interest rates. So in fact, they're really low. So why are we not shooting for 100% or 125% of GDP?
Mm-hmm. That's fair. So we believe that 75% is just about the lowest bound that we can hit without suffering any serious sort of cut to like integral social spending programs and entitlement spending programs within our country. We felt that 75 was a number that was comfortable. It's low enough to have low interest payments, and also not too how do I say this? Like, it's not going to take away from any necessary sort of spending.
I guess big opening question would be, did you all think about the healthcare side of the budget and changes there, either in spending or tax treatment?
So specifically with the healthcare portion of the budget and Medicare and Medicaid, we initially started to take a look into it. However, we found difficulties in political feasibility in terms of.
Could you speak a little louder, please, or closer to the microphone?
So at least initially, we started to take a look into Medicare and Medicaid, as they are large parts of the annual budget. However, we found difficulty in terms of political feasibility and being able to hold up against specifically recently passed bills such as Medicare and Medicaid Part D, in terms of prescription drug prices and how they are affecting lobbying efforts, et cetera, making it relatively difficult to actually make large-scale and effective changes without having large pushback.
But do you view it as a problem that what one might see as the main driver of our fiscal problems you do not address? Healthcare?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
One of the main drivers of our debt problems is healthcare, And do you think there's a disconnect there that you don't really seem to address it, even though I realize the political difficulties?
So we address part of healthcare within our presentation. So specifically the implementation of the triplicate state program that relies on what are known as PDMPs, so prescription drug
In the
monitoring.
opioid.
Yes.
The opioids?
Yeah. The opioid policy. Yeah, so this cleans up some of the inefficiencies in the Medicare Part D, also known as the Medicare Prescription Drug Benefit. That's the U.S. federal government program that is used to subsidize costs of prescription drugs and whatnot. So through this plank of our policy, we figured that we could clean up a little bit, at least, of excess healthcare spending.
Additionally, if we were to take on healthcare and propose certain spending cuts that could have negative social impacts compared to where cuts to defense or a carbon tax wouldn't necessarily have the same impacts to people's health and well-being.
So speaking of defense cuts, I guess I have two questions. You presented both like a one-year savings in like 2018, and you also presented were some dollar amounts, including changing our nuclear first strike capabilities and so on and so forth. And those were in dollar amounts. How did you? I presume those were CBO's numbers and those would be a 10-year number. How did you extrapolate defense savings out past the 10-year budget window, the first 10 years into this next 10? And
Absolutely. So I suppose the policy proposal itself is a shift in U.S. defense grant strategy. And in this way, when I was presenting these numbers initially, they are short-term changes necessary within 10-year projections if we were to make these changes. However, the notion of shifting to a grant strategy of defense would be long-term strategic choices in terms of acquisition programs, et cetera, and making sure we reduce these redundancies. In this way, we're able to take data from both Cato and Brookings Institute, who have analyzed necessarily the long-term effects over 30 years, and we're able to necessarily propagate these defense cuts past the 10-year window. All of these defense cuts were necessarily discussed in detail, specifically with former Pentagon advisors and feasibilities, et cetera, who were proponents of this shift in grant strategy to restraint.
About how much of a cut in defense spending are we actually talking about?
This would be about an 18% cut from the 2018 budget.
And then it would stay about 18 going forward?
It would. There were some difficulties in terms of predicting future defense spending, only because it's very difficult to predict future interactions with or military interactions, whether we large-scale wars, say 10 years down the road. So we didn't incorporate these large shocks in spending. However, we basically maintained this idea that this change in thought process would propagate future thought in terms of acquisition programs down the road. So roughly 18% continuously.
Okay, now is that we cut 18% and then that new dollar amount is the dollar amount we spend on defense every year going forward? Or does that we cut by 18% and then that new amount grows by some rate going on in the future?
Well,
how does that work?
Again, it's difficult to predict specifically the shocks to spending. We did incorporate a 2% annual growth of defense spending, partially to normalize the number. So we continuing forward. It's just unfortunately it's very difficult for the costs and our predictions of costs in the future for defense spending. We tried to keep the numbers as round as possible and just to make predictions. it's just difficult.
So what are your spending to GDP and revenue to GDP numbers look, in 10 years versus today? Was there a chart? Maybe I missed that chart.
You're referring to a level change?
Yeah, so if it was, is spending to GDP, is it 23%, 27%, 20%?
So you're talking about the final level.
You're spending the GDP ratio, yeah.
Yeah, so our final level is 73%.
No, spending as a share of GDP.
Yeah.
I don't believe we have that stat on hand. However, we do have the level shock to GDP as well as the level shock to spending. To debt, sorry, excuse me.
So do you guys have a sense at all how spending in the future compares to baseline or revenue compares to baseline? You guys presented everything in debt to GDP, but do you have a sense of the mix of spending cuts or revenue increases, as a percentage of how much you're cutting deficits?
Yes. Fine. So what we did was we calculated the total reduction in government spending, and we calculated the total addition to GDP, and then we added those to the CBO numbers to come up with the changed final debt to GDP ratio. Yeah, so we have a net reduction in debt of about 18 trillion, and then about 11 additional dollars of output from GDP. So we mostly cut spending.
And that is through the defense cuts? Or is that through, what other spending cuts did you have besides defense?
Mm-hmm. So we cut spending through the defense cuts. We raised revenue through the carbon tax. The CPI and Social Security policies also cut spending in addition to the opioid policies and the VAT.
Okay.
So in terms of changes to GDP, so you mentioned the education effort and the immigration effort. Did you try to account for GDP effects of the other policy levers you were pulling on?
Yes, in response to the Social Security, we took a look and we found that the effects on GDP would be neutral. There would be a negative effect in the first years of the program since there'd be less money in people's pockets, and there would be a bit of a work incentive, a disincentive to work, so that would decrease productivity. But in a paper by Christina Romer and David Romer, we found that these affects the taxes that affect the national deficit, they decrease over time. So we found that over the 30-year period, the effects to GDP would be neutral.
In regards to the carbon tax, the shift to the carbon tax is also paired with the ongoing regulatory rollback of the Trump administration, which, according to assumptions made in a plan by the Climate Leadership Council, would have the net effect being neutral. So in our models, we built in an initial shock to the tax, but in the long run, the effect on GDP should be negligible.
Okay, thanks.
How did you guys model the education bump to GDP growth? It looks like you guys assumed kind of a 1.9 to 2.2% change in the growth rate. When does that kick in? How much? I also found the impact of that GDP ratio to be kind of small relative to a 0.3% change in the rate of GDP growth. How did you guys think about that? Or am I capturing that right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last half of that?
Last part is just the debt to GDP ratio goes down 1%, but it looks like you guys have a 0.3% bump in the growth rate, which I find those two numbers to be a little surprising. I would have expected a bigger impact on the debt to GDP ratio, so I just want to make sure I have that right in terms of how you guys thought about it.
Yeah, so I'll just start off by talking about the methodology for how we got to that change in the growth rate. So the paper that we used for that was from Sebastian de Sousa, and it talked about an exact variation between a deviation in education quality and the growth rate of GDP. And then so we assumed that this change would kick in at 2028, which would be 10 years after the policy's implementation, when students would hypothetically enter the workforce, so they'd start to see the effects from that. And then we assumed that that would slowly grow until 2047. And so within that, when we calculated that exact change in growth rate, the average for the 30 years ended up being 2.2% compared to 1.9%. And then as far as the 1% shock, I would also say the way that the percentage points were added in towards the end of the policies with the other policies and the changes that jet to GDP did compound. So I think when we look at our policies within net, they collectively work together.
So what was the highest growth rate? So 2.2 is the average. Where was the, in 2047, what was the growth rate you guys had based on this policy and your others?
I cannot say that off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I do not have those numbers in front of me.
Of course.
Roughly, I would say 4 to 5%.
Got it. Yeah. So what is the cumulative effect of your plan? What sector of what group of people in the economy does this hit the most? What's the distributional impact of the cumulative plan that you guys have put together?
So the cumulative effect of our policies is it's largely from higher socioeconomic status. We transfer some of that wealth to the lower socioeconomic status. So we think about policies like VAT, we think about education, immigration, the carbon tax, defense spending. Some of these have a tendency to disproportionately affect those of the lower socioeconomic status, but we have redistributionary policies built into these policies, mostly in the form of a dividend or some sort of redistribution, so that it's spread evenly across the economy and not damaging one sector too extremely.
One more question.
One more.
Yeah.
Oh, so just could you walk me through quickly how big the Social Security effect was that you got from the two ideas you put out there?
Yes. So the cumulative effect was reducing the debt by 0.73%, and so this in the end would decrease the debt to GDP ratio by 1 percentage point overall. Because we found that the net effect on GDP would be neutral in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Hello? Oh.
What really seems outside of the bounds of the Senate procedure. Anything involving Senate procedure is outside the bounds right now. There may be a Senate sidecar, but because
how dare House members?
It's exactly it. And I mean, a lot of thinking is going into the appropriations process because there's just so many appropriators on these joint subcommittees. But mostly
They
it's
had like a little drop down.
timing shifts. Like, I mean, it's whether or not they make the fiscal year the calendar.
We can't hear you still.
There is some logic to that. Going to a calendar year, fiscal year.
Yeah.
There should be a microphone like icon you can click to unmute.
Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yeah. You brought down the drop down menu and there was one where you have the microphone muted.
Yeah, and then.
Hello?
go to-
All right, we can hear you.
To.
Can you hear us?
Can we hear you? Can you say something to see if we can hear you?
Hello?
Yes.
Hello? Hello?
Okay, we can't hear you yet. Okay.
Okay.
Just take that off. So.
Oh, now it should work.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi.
Can you hear
okay,
us?
we can hear you.
Okay. There we go.
If you guys want to get set up, then we can get started.
Yeah. Okay, you're just gonna talk loud.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
And what other teams have done is they've put the presentation and shared their screen.
Yeah.
And then just talk to the presentation, and then we take that down for the Q&A so we can all see you.
Sounds good. I'm gonna get the screen share up. Oh no, wait. If I present first. Oh, okay. Wait. Haha, I can do this.
I can do this.
Select. Oh, I can there.
There's like plus. Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Okay.
So whenever you guys are situated, take your time to get situated, but we are ready on our end to start the presentation whenever you are. Actually, do you want to do this?
Yeah. I'll quickly go around and we can do intros and then I can lay down the ground rules. So I'm Michal representing the Fiscal Challenge.
I'm Jim Pethokoukis from American Enterprise Institute.
Hi, I'm Zachary Moller from the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget.
And Donald Marron from the Urban Institute.
And Russ Grody from Hamilton Place Strategies.
So you guys will have 12 minutes for your presentation and 18 minutes for the Q&A. I'll keep time and I will give you warnings at the 5-minute mark, 1-minute mark, and when time's up, after which you have to stop talking. And don't forget to remain anonymous, so don't share names or school identification. But let us know when you're ready and I will start the timer.
We're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, and thank you for your attention. The following is our team's policy presentation for the 2018 College Fiscal Challenge. To begin, we will examine the United States economic outlook. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is projected to be 150% in 2047. Long-term national debt in the U.S. has negative consequences for our economy that will only become more extreme without policy change. As debt obligations continually grow, Congress will face rising interest payments on its debt. These interest costs are projected to be the second largest portion of the federal spending by 2047, putting increased strain on the national budget and risking the funding of essential government programs. Furthermore, it wouldn't just be public investment that could be crowded out. Private citizens looking to invest by borrowing may face higher interest rates in the future, which would discourage the borrowing and suppress economic growth. This would have a real impact on all citizens, manifesting in slower wage growth and it becoming harder to retire, own a home, or start a business. If an economic downturn were to occur, Congress will have less flexibility to respond to a crisis due to these increased budgetary strains. This is compounded by an increased risk of a recession and a greater risk of investors losing faith that the U.S. will pay back its debts. If these consequences didn't make the national debt an urgent enough issue, it is important to note that the changes made to taxes or spending to make up for our growing debt will only become more drastic as we wait to act, as we cannot spread costs over time. In response, our team proposes a group of policies that will enhance fiscal responsibility by 1, reprioritizing government spending, 2, enacting progressive tax reforms, and 3, modernizing the U.S. immigration system. Not only will these policies stabilize the debt to GDP ratio of the country, they will do so in a manner that focuses on long-term solutions and spreading rather than concentrating costs. As we progress through this proposal, we will have a progress bar at the bottom of each slide displaying the impact each policy has on decreasing the debt to GDP ratio by 2047. Our first group of proposals concerns reprioritizing government spending. Within this category are reductions in defense spending, reduced industry-specific subsidies, and a phase-out of the United States Postal Service.
The first spending we will trim is defense spending. The largest portion of the United States' discretionary budget. This will be accomplished through 2 methods. Our first proposal is that Congress approve another round of base realignment and closure, referred to as BROC, which has occurred in the past and garners support from the Department of Defense, or DoD. Our second policy involves replacing some military personnel with civilian employees, which also has precedent within the DoD. Importantly, these cuts avoid reducing defense capability and only cut what is truly excess capacity. In a letter to Congress in 2016 requesting BROC, then Secretary of Defense Robert O. Work estimated that the DoD had 22% excess infrastructure. By allowing the DoD to reduce spending in ways that they see fit, BROC could actually relieve burdens of maintenance and permit a greater focus on other areas of military readiness. Precedent and DoD support for this policy option give us reason to believe that BROC could be a politically palatable option for Congress members, especially framed in terms of enhancing military readiness. Replacing some military positions with civilians also has military precedent. Our policy will replace 80,000 commercial military positions with approximately 64,000 civilian personnel. In doing so, the DoD would save time and resources normally dedicated towards intensive training and frequent transfers required of military personnel. These savings are practical options for reducing the federal deficit and cutting waste from the military budget. In combination, these policies will reduce the debt to GDP ratio in 2047 by 0.8 percentage points.
Next, we are going to look at agricultural subsidies. Since the Great Depression, when subsidies were first introduced, farmers have exploded to become economic juggernauts, with median farm income 49% above the average household, making large-scale government support unnecessary. Further, subsidies have been distorted to favor larger farms, as 80% of the smallest farms only get 17% of subsidies. These 2 factors have led to inefficiency and excessive surpluses, as government subsidies have damaged normal market conditions. The United States government currently provides $25 billion per year in subsidies to the agricultural industry. As seen in the chart, we propose to cut these subsidies by 40% through reducing Title I commodity and Title XI insurance programs. This includes limiting agricultural risk coverage and price loss coverage, so there is not a double safety net to pay farmers for low yields and low prices simultaneously with insurance subsidies. The cumulative effect would cut government expenditures by $10 billion per year. Adopted in 1935, prior to a federal minimum wage, the Davis-Bacon Act requires government construction workers be paid prevailing wages. However, today this act has transformed into a subsidy to the construction industry, as inaccurate and outdated calculations have resulted in excessive wage rates being paid. The CBO sets the value of repeal at $4.8 billion per year, and extending this out to 2047 results in total savings of $144 billion. The total reduction in the debt to GDP ratio for the combined subsidies would be 2.7 percentage points. Next, we look at to reform the U.S. Postal Service, as a government-subsidized postal service no longer makes fiscal sense due to economic and technological changes. The $18 billion in preferential treatment, piling deficits, and pension liabilities demonstrate the post office's fiscal problems, and these will only further accumulate if reform is not enacted. We propose to end this government monopoly in favor of private competition. First, we would sell the service's $105 billion in assets over a 30-year period. With this revenue, we would immediately pay off pensions so that liabilities don't compound and past problems with overpayments that have led to over $100 billion in waste would end. Finally, privatization would result in the government not being on the hook for postal service losses and a potential bailout. In total, we estimate this would reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 4.2%.
After taking into account all of our spending policies, the final debt to GDP ratio in 2047 would be 142.3%. Now we move on to the tax reform section, which has three components: inflation adjustments for the tax code, a financial tax, and a Social Security payroll tax. These will make our tax system more progressive, and the increases in revenue will help stabilize our fiscal situation. The first part of our tax reform section involves changing the measure of inflation used in the tax code. First, we will look at what parts of the tax code inflation affects: the size of the standard deduction, the size of the personal and dependent exemptions, the income ranges for income tax brackets, the size of the gift tax, and credit phase-outs are all affected by inflation. Inflation also affects similar measures of the alternative minimum tax. We propose that we shift from the CPIU to the chain CPIU. The CPIU suffers from substitution bias and small sample bias. This means it overestimates the actual change in cost of living, lowering overall tax revenue. The chain CPIU has a lower cost of living increase measure, which increases tax revenues across the tax base broadly. While one concern is that monthly estimates are frequently adjusted, according to Jeffrey Kling of the CBO, these are small errors, and by readjusting each year's errors, they won't propagate. After determining we should switch to a more accurate measure of inflation, we turn to CBO projections about our proposal. We forecast that this change would lead to a deficit reduction of 7.5 percentage points in 2047.
We propose that we should impose a tax on the purchase of most securities and on transactions involving derivatives. The tax would be 0.02% of the value of the security or derivative contract payments. It would not apply to the initial issuance of stock or debt securities. It would apply to transactions that occurred within the U.S. and any offshore transactions made by a U.S. taxpayer. This proposal is a deviation from the CBO's similar proposal that uses a 1 basis point tax. This 2 basis point tax on financial transactions will reduce the debt to GDP ratio by 37 percentage points in 2047. At the most fundamental level, financial transactions should allocate resources most effectively. This proposal would significantly reduce the amount of short-term speculation and computer-assisted high-frequency trading that currently directs resources in an ineffective manner and would direct the resources to more productive uses. Finally, a transaction tax could reduce volatility by lowering the volume of trading and reducing the effects of noise trading.
Finally, we look at the largest federal spending program, Social Security. According to the Social Security Administration, the program will run a cumulative deficit of $2.8 trillion from now until 2034. The OASDI trust fund will run out in 2034, and after that, only 77% of benefits will be paid. We considered altering Social Security benefits to address this shortfall, but we felt that went contrary to the spirit of the program. Instead, we proposed to subject earnings greater than $250,000 to the payroll tax. The public supports raising taxes to support Social Security, and this policy does not affect benefits paid out from the program. CBO evidence shows that this policy would only affect working decisions at the margins, and this reform makes the payroll tax more progressive. After deciding upon our tax reform, we looked at CBO numbers and generated a linear regression line based off of the data. This policy results in a debt reduction of 26.6 percentage points of 2047 levels. The final debt to GDP ratio after all of the policies we proposed thus far is 71.8% in 2047.
Our last policy type regards modernization of the U.S. immigration system. This reform is timely. The last legislative reform the U.S. has passed regarding immigration was over 30 years ago, with the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. The comprehensive reform to the U.S. immigration system will create fiscal sustainability in its own right and enhance other policies we have spoken to earlier in this presentation. In choosing a path for reform for immigration, our team focused on options similar to those modeled in the bipartisan Senate Bill 744. After evaluating benefits to GDP growth, increased tax revenue, and increased federal expenditures, the CBO has stated that the provisions in this bill would result in a net decrease in the federal deficit by $897 billion over a 20-year period. This could dispel fears that increases in government benefits for an increased population would outweigh the positive effects of those provisions, namely an increased size of the labor force, heightened productivity of that labor force, and increased investment in capital. As a whole, this reform would reduce the debt to GDP ratio in 2047 by 5.2 percentage points.
Also worth noting is that immigration reform will positively impact other fiscal challenges in this country. As most immigrants will be members of a younger population, we'd expect solvency of the Social Security program to improve and federal tax revenue to increase. Combined with the other policies in this presentation, the proposal as a whole offers solutions that are broad-based, persistent, and allocate government spending to areas that are most important for future economic prosperity. Our final debt to GDP ratio is 67% in 2047. We've overshot the target of stabilizing the debt to GDP ratio precisely because we believe that there are inevitable uncertainties lying in projections. We have left a substantial cushion to correct for errors. Further, an economic crisis or a new war might start in the future, altering the budget calculus. By leaving a cushion between our final debt to GDP ratio and the current debt to GDP ratio, we've allowed for emergencies to occur without busting the budget. Thank you for your time. Okay, so.
Thanks, guys. Could you lower the presentation so we can see you for the Q&A?
Yeah, so if I stop share, does that work?
Yes, yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, so thanks for that. I guess first question up would be, did you give any thoughts to Medicare, Medicaid changes on the health side of the budget?
So one of the reasons why we didn't is because we wanted to focus on not hitting the same groups multiple times. We didn't want to hit elderly people and people on healthcare in multiple different ways. And we wanted to focus on solutions that were more broad-based. So that's like what we incorporated in our proposal with the different tax changes and the different minor cuts into subsidies and persistent solutions in that respect. Do you have anything else to add?
The only other thing I can add is that to be more explicit, Medicare and also our impact to Social Security taxes would affect the same group of folks. And so we decided that it would be better to go with broad reforms, like Mitchell said, with a broad-based tax reform that would affect more citizens in this country at a lower cost than it would for healthcare, which is such an important service provided to those citizens too.
And thinking about the trade-off between Social Security and healthcare, did you think about Social Security is money? You can buy healthcare with money, but you can't eat healthcare. So did you think about that choice when you picked kind of between Social Security and healthcare?
Yeah, we considered those issues, but we felt that changing like healthcare costs, especially for the elderly and the poorest people, would be worse off because those are fixed costs of those people already have incorporated in their budget and might encourage them not to go to the hospital as much because they would because that money is set specifically aside for healthcare when they get it, that it's easier for them to justify going to the hospital or going to get care that they need instead of it was just a direct cash transfusion. That would encourage them maybe to not choose the optimal amount of healthcare that the government feels people should have.
Since we were just talking about Social Security, allowing the payroll tax cap to go above incomes above $250,000. In your proposal, is $250,000 indexed to inflation over the rest of the window, and also do people accrue Social Security benefits for paying that payroll tax above $250,000?
Basically, what our proposal is so there's the current taxable maximum, right, which determines how much benefits you receive, but also how much taxes you pay. The payroll tax we levy above $250,000 would not be indexed to inflation because the taxable maximum would still rise independently of that. The CBO projects that by 2037, under this proposal, the taxable maximum would exceed $250,000. In terms of our proposal, the reason why it generates so much revenue is because the people paying above $250,000, if you make income above $250,000, when you pay payroll taxes on income made above $250,000, that does not contribute to the benefits you receive out. And the reason the reason we don't feel that will be an issue is because overall there's broad public support for keeping Social Security solvent. These people realize that they want their children to be able to access it. And also we found it wouldn't affect working decisions. And like I said, the taxable maximum would rise as well, over time as it currently does.
At any point, did you think about questioning the premise of whether a 75% or lower GDP target was even appropriate versus, a higher target?
We did, and at the end of our presentation, we discussed how undershooting that target was beneficial for our proposals, given that any projection has uncertainties in it. We can't guarantee that the projections that we have are completely accurate. Furthermore, if we wanted to build in the possibility of a war or a recession happening, we wanted to build in that policy flexibility that currently doesn't exist with increased strains on the budget.
But did you at all discuss questioning even the CBO's premise about the impact of higher debt levels on economic growth, on interest rates. There certainly is a lot of debate about those issues. Did you have that debate amongst yourselves at all?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly looked when trying to determine a target level. We looked, and I guess our long-term outlook was that we wanted to stabilize it because of the future accumulations and so if we didn't adjust, I mean, there are certain different theories, maybe Ricardian equivalence and some exact models that maybe deficit versus taxing the burden over a long time might not matter, but we really think that it is important to solve this problem on a more localized and a more immediate manner than to stretch it out. And if we were to keep the target higher than we did, then that would just lead to further problems down the road.
And one other note on that quick is that if you look historically, when our debt to GDP ratio has been this high, it's been due to specific factors like World War II or major wars, where the debt to GDP ratio after those incidences it was expected to decrease again post-war. Whereas we're looking at just a constant accumulation of debt. And so we felt like this was a unique scenario that presented its own challenges. And that's why we wanted to stabilize it rather than allow it to increase higher. But we did consider it, like Stephen said, allowing it to grow.
Alrighty, so can I ask about the financial transactions tax?
Yes.
So if I understand correctly, that is the biggest element of your plan. I will confess to being surprised at how big it was, and so I was hoping you could walk me through that.
Yes, so we looked at the CBO's initial projection, and they had based it off a 1 basis point tax. We think that we see that markets are inelastic. We looked at this fact, looking at different fees charged by index funds. We saw that they can be as low as 14 basis points to 1,600 basis points for nearly similar products. We took that as saying that markets are inelastic, and therefore we assumed that a 2 basis point tax would also be reasonable. And using that increase in basis point coupled with the CBO projections, we got to our reduction in GDP.
Yeah, and the CBO projections do take into account that in the first year, there's actually projected losses of about 35 billion because of an immediate reaction on like capital gains, lost revenue in that sense. But they actually project that over time, that friction that firms would adjust, and that since it's such a minuscule amount, that the long-term effects wouldn't be too great. I mean, we've seen proposals by people such as Senator Bernie Sanders for a 40-point basis tax, but we thought a 2% or a 2-point would be less impactful on affecting the market, potentially driving out people to other countries. We thought that it was low enough that they would stay.
So how much money does it bring in each year at the beginning?
The first year it would actually be, the government would lose revenue of 100 billion. And then from that on, it would increase. The next year would be, for say, like 26 billion. And then as the companies begin to impose these, to be able to build the structure around these taxes, by 2020, they say it should be bringing in 160 billion per year. And then it increases through a linear projection that we used using the CBO data gave us till 2026, and we use a linear regression to push that out to 2047.
Okay, thanks.
So do you guys have a sense as a summary statistic about how much you are relying on revenue increases versus relying on spending cuts?
We're relying fairly heavily on revenue increases. If you look to our proposal, the 3 tax reform adjustments were Grace's was 37%, and then the 2 I presented were 26% of our reduction and 7.5%. And then our immigration numbers were a combination of growth and increased revenue, but also different changes in that for the modeling. So we are relying more heavily on tax revenue, but it's important that a lot of our tax revenue comes from specifically looking at the CPIU change. CPIU, that's not affecting any single taxpayer dramatically. It's a broad-based change that's what's generating the revenue, similar to the transaction tax or things like that.
So, can you easily summarize who are the winners and losers from this plan?
So I guess that was something we really looked at throughout. Obviously, the people at the top, our primary target were those margins so that no one individual would be affected. Probably the more considerate, overall the cumulative effect would hurt the highest class. But we hoped that all of that was at a small enough level that it wouldn't affect their purchasing decisions, and even the agricultural subsidies. We were targeting those farms that had a great wealth and therefore didn't need government supplements.
In our proposal, we clearly state that our tax reforms in general are progressive tax reforms. Right now, we're seeing a increase in income inequality, and we as a group thought that was an issue that maybe wasn't necessarily asked by the prompt, but we found it to be a large issue in our country right now, and something that when looking at long-term solutions needed to be addressed, and that's why we did target progressive tax reform.
So between when CBO made these initial long-term projections and today, we've had a big change in tax policy. How would you view the change in tax policy affecting your ability to either do your progressive tax reform, or would it require you to do additional tax reforms, or how would you guys address the big tax cut?
So yeah, I mean, right off the bat, it definitely affects sort of the changes obviously weren't in place at the time of the CBO's projections, although they've just recently released new projections that is the deficits are going to rise even more. But then, so in the short term, we have to take those into effect, but we also recognize that this current tax bill, I mean, under reconciliation rules and like the Berg rule, it can only last for 10 years. So looking out further than that, there's no certainty that the same economic effects of the newest tax law will still remain long-term. So we're hoping that this program would sort of supplement that now and then mold into its own form once those expire.
If I could add as well, the new tax bill added a decent amount of debt projections to the federal budget. And when we talk about increased strains on the federal budget, affecting what we can spend on discretionary policy, and also there's been talk in the news of decreases to mandatory spending as well. Programs like Social Security and Medicare in the news recently have been facing mentions of possibly cuts by the Trump administration. And so we think that added debt as well puts increased pressure and potentially an option for political feasibility when we think about options to reduce spending with our policies or also enact broad-based tax reform too.
Was there any conversation about repealing, parts of the recent tax plan, like the big business, the corporate rate cuts, maybe, rolling those back?
So there was some discussion of the exact effects of the tax bill and trying to change those effects. One large part of the problem is the tax bill had a number of provisions that weren't exactly fleshed out that the IRS needed to make specific decisions on. Like, for example, I know I did research into the depreciation sections of the tax bill, and the tax bill didn't include specific tables that would allow you to know when to depreciate certain items, and they changed rules that the IRS then needed to make a fix, like a regulatory fix upon. So the reason we decided to focus on more issues without repealing or changing the structure of the tax reform were, one, because of the very nature of the tax bill, we thought it was best to focus on broader solutions, and two, we were running into some political feasibility components of how politically feasible would it be to repeal a bill that was just passed by the current Senate, House, and administration composition.
Did you all give any consideration to carbon tax?
When we did give consideration to a carbon tax, we were thinking long-term about carbon dependency. And we feel that in the future, there wouldn't be as great of a carbon dependency in this country, and that those revenues would not be as persistent and long-term as we could get with other tax revenue options. And I would say that's probably the biggest reason. Also, a carbon tax could tend to be regressive depending on how it's implemented.
Thanks.
do you have a sense of where revenue would go under your policy? So, my back of the envelope calculations are that roughly 90% of your savings come from revenue sources. Do you have a sense of where, about how big revenue as a share of the economy would be by the end?
We don't have exact numbers on how big the tax revenue would be as a share of the economy at the end. Obviously, due to the nature of the tax increase, the total, the number of, or the amount of revenue would be larger than it currently stands. I'd have to factor in GDP growth numbers as to change the overall factor. In terms of your where revenue would go question, we don't have a specific place for the revenue to necessarily go, or we didn't wants to tackle it.
Although it's worth mentioning that there's really high priorities for the government budget, such as Social Security and ensuring its solvency. That could be a primary place that we would send this great revenue that we're getting from taxes. Furthermore, healthcare being such a priority in the budget would be somewhere where it could go. Other considerations that we were speaking of that don't have firm proposals on would be promoting long-term options that would increase long-term growth in the country, so things that affect productivity of our economy, like increasing education, making sure that there is proper healthcare, that sort of thing.
Curious, a lot of your proposals seem to kind of moderate. You kind of had moderate effects of what you're trying to solve for, like making broad hits small, but yet you decided to just completely end the USPS. So I'm curious how you guys. Why on that particular piece you went more aggressive and just said we're going to sell it all off, we're going to roll it out, and how did you guys think about the timing on that?
Yeah, I guess our concern with the Postal Service specifically was just we've seen in the past how much the pension liabilities and the pre-funding aspect of those have been of controversy with they passed an Accountability Act in 2006 that required Postal Service to spend $5 billion on pre-funding those. Post office and sort of the unions around it weren't particularly happy with that. So I guess in that sense, we saw an immediate burden of pensions and miscalculations leading to waste that ultimately was the best solution was to do a complete reform and privatization because of the occurring increasing interest and debt payments versus something like the agricultural subsidies that we did gradually. That maybe in the long run we could increase, but we saw those as not needing to immediately be ended all at once.
Do you guys think at all about, and feel free to think about this and reason this out loud, but where the political challenges are in ending the Postal Service? So
yeah, obviously rural areas. Their post office is under a mandate to deliver mail to everyone right now. So our hope would be that private firms would enter and do competition for those specific areas. But we also consider that in the long run, we see technological changes being a major component. We see the demand for mail has dramatically decreased in the last 10 years. So long run, we see other groups. The Postal Service has an agreement with Amazon right now that actually is one of the reasons they're still not in a complete disaster. But we think that if we can help supplement those rural areas with maybe merger contract specifics that require bi-weekly or weekly delivery to less served areas, that could help solve that.
Yeah, specifically as Stephen was referencing, if you look in the past when there's been mergers, the DOJ has sometimes imposed certain restrictions upon them. You saw this for electricity companies or when landlines were a big thing, that the DOJ imposed certain restrictions to ensure that the public had access to these issues, to these vital utilities. So you could see that if the companies that take over some post office units, as Stephen was mentioning, merging, that the DOJ could impose rules that they had to deliver to these rural areas. And these companies would still be incentivized to do that because they'd still get access to the USPS's overall market share.
I think that's all the time we have. But,
thank you guys.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.